What happens when a corrupt cop tries to rob the wrong man? Officer Bradley thought he was untouchable until he pocketed Shaq's wallet and smirked, thinking he had just made an easy $5,000. But what he didn't know, FBI cameras were rolling. The entire sting operation was set. And Shaq, he wasn't just a target, he was the bait. The second Bradley walked away, thinking he had won, a voice crackled over the radio. "All units, move in." The dirty cop turned, confusion on his face, as FBI agents stepped out of the shadows. "Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe." The night air was still, the hum of distant traffic the only sound breaking the silence. Shaquille O'Neal leaned against his gleaming black Rolls-Royce, parked under the dim glow of a street lamp in an empty lot. He checked his watch. Any moment now. The FBI's plan had been set for weeks, and tonight Shaq was playing the most unexpected role of his life. Bait. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, moving slow, deliberate. The squad car rolled to a stop, red and blue lights flashing once before shutting off. A heavy-set figure stepped out, the click of his boots against the pavement echoing in the quiet. Officer Bradley. He adjusted his duty belt, resting a hand on the holster of his gun as he approached, his flashlight slicing through the darkness, right into Shaq's face. "License and registration!" Bradley barked, his voice carrying that familiar, forced authority. Shaq squinted against the beam of light, pretending to be irritated. "Seriously? For what?" Bradley smirked, lowering the flashlight just enough to let their eyes meet. "For being too damn rich." Shaq exhaled slowly, his face unreadable. The FBI had warned him. Bradley didn't just target high-profile names. He had a long history of shaking down anyone who looked like easy prey, padding his pockets while hiding behind a badge. The problem was, he had never been caught. Until tonight. Shaq reached inside his car, careful and slow, pulling out his license and registration. He handed them over without a word. Bradley barely glanced at them. "Step out of the vehicle?" Shaq tilted his head. "For what?" "Step out," Bradley repeated, his voice carrying a sharp edge. Shaq sighed dramatically, pushing open the door and rising to his full height. The streetlight cast a long shadow beneath him, making him look even larger than usual. Even still, Bradley didn't flinch. He had done this before. Bullied, intimidated, stolen. He thought tonight would be no different. Shaq kept his posture relaxed. "What now?" Bradley took a step forward, scanning the interior of the car. That's when he spotted it. A designer wallet sitting on the passenger seat, thick with cash. His expression barely shifted, but Shaq caught the flicker of greed in his eyes. Bradley clicked his tongue. "Looks like you've got a lot of money on you." Shaq shrugged. "I do all right." Bradley smirked, stepping closer. "You know, carrying that much cash is suspicious, almost like you're up to something illegal." Shaq's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. This was what the FBI needed, evidence. Bradley reached in through the open car door and snatched the wallet without hesitation, flipping it open. Inside was exactly what he expected. Hundreds, neatly stacked. Shaq watched him, expression unreadable. Bradley exhaled, tapping the bills with his fingers. "Now here's the thing," he said casually. "A guy like me, I work hard, put my life on the line every day. And what do I get for it? A paycheck that barely covers my rent." He turned the wallet in his hands. "So, I think it's only fair that guys like you, guys who have more than they need, help out guys like me." Shaq leaned against the car, arms crossed. "You sure you want to do that?" Bradley chuckled, slipping the wallet into his pocket like it belonged there. "What, you gonna report me?" He scoffed. "Yeah, good luck with that." The night felt heavier. The silence stretched. Then, hidden in the darkness, a single red light blinked. The FBI's cameras were rolling. Shaq didn't move, didn't react. He simply glanced at his phone and with one tap sent a single-word message to the team waiting in the shadows. "Go." Bradley turned, whistling as he strolled back toward his squad car, thinking he had just made an easy $5,000. That's when it happened. The crackle of radio static. A voice came through. "All units, move in." Shaq folded his arms and watched as, from the darkness, figures began to emerge. Distant sirens grew louder. Bradley's smug grin faded. He turned slowly, the color draining from his face. The night wasn't so quiet anymore, and for the first time Officer Bradley realized he was the one being hunted. The night stretched on, the air thick with tension. Bradley had done this routine 100 times before, pulling over the right kind of person, the kind who wouldn't fight back, wouldn't report him. But tonight, he had no idea who he was dealing with. Leaning into the Rolls-Royce, Bradley's flashlight swept over the pristine leather interior, but his eyes weren't searching for trouble. They were searching for opportunity. Then he saw it. Sitting right there on the passenger seat was a sleek designer wallet, slightly open, revealing crisp $100 bills stacked neatly inside. A payday waiting to be claimed. Bradley barely hesitated. He reached in, his fingers closing around the wallet with practiced ease, slipping it out like it belonged to him. His breath hitched slightly as he flipped it open, eyes drinking in the sight of neatly arranged cash. Thick, heavy, more than enough to make his night worthwhile. His lips curled into a grin. Well, that's a lot of green for one guy to be carrying around. Shaq, still leaning against the car, barely moved. His expression remained unreadable. Calm. Too calm. Bradley thumbed through the bills, a low whistle escaping his lips. You know, most people ain't stupid enough to leave this kind of cash just lying around. Almost feels like you want someone to take it. He looked up at Shaq, smirking. And lucky for you, I know just the guy. Shaq exhaled slowly, shaking his head. You sure you want to do that? Bradley laughed, sliding the wallet into his pocket. What, you gonna call the cops? His tone dripped with amusement. I am the cops, big guy. Ain't nobody coming to help you tonight. He patted his vest, his badge gleaming under the streetlight as if to remind Shaq who had the power here. Shaq didn't flinch. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, studying Bradley with quiet amusement. You ever steal from the wrong guy before? Bradley scoffed. Ain't no wrong guy. There's just people who got money and people like me who take a little tax for keeping the streets safe. Shaq smirked. Yeah? And what happens when the streets start watching? Bradley's smile faltered, just for a second. A barely noticeable flicker of doubt crossed his face. Shaq lifted his phone slightly, just enough for Bradley to catch a glimpse of the screen. A single word had been sent. Go. Bradley frowned. What the hell was that? Shaq shrugged. You'll find out soon enough. Suddenly, the radio on Bradley's shoulder crackled with static. The noise cut through the night like a knife, the familiar voice on the other end sending a ripple of unease through him. All units, move in. The grin disappeared from Bradley's face. From the darkness beyond the parking lot, shadows began to shift. Figures moved into position, closing in. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed against the pavement. The dirty cop had no idea. His night was about to take a turn he'd never forget. Bradley chuckled as he patted his chest, feeling the thick designer wallet snug in his vest pocket. To him, it was already his. Just another easy score. What? He smirked at Shaq, shaking his head. You gonna report me? Call 911? Hate to break it to you, big guy, but I am 9/11. The arrogance in his voice dripped like oil, slick and unshakable. He'd done this dozens of times before, shaking down the rich, taking his cut, walking away like nothing happened. No one ever fought back. No one ever dared. Shaq, however, wasn't just anyone. You don't know who I am, do you? Shaq asked, his voice steady, almost amused. Bradley scoffed. Just another rich guy who thinks he runs the city. He rolled his eyes. But out here, on this street, I run things. Shaq pulled out his phone casually, tapping the screen with a single finger. A moment later, the display flashed as a text was sent. Just one word. Go. Bradley squinted, shifting his stance. The hell was that? Shaq smirked, tucking his phone back into his pocket. You'll see. For a brief second, the silence stretched between them, the kind of silence that made your instincts whisper that something was wrong. But Bradley shook off the feeling. No way this guy had the guts to do anything. Yeah, all right, Bradley muttered, taking a step back. Listen, do yourself a favor. Forget about this. Trust me, complaining ain't worth it. He tapped his vest where his badge sat. Some guys get lucky in life. Some guys make their own luck. With a final sneer, he turned and walked toward his squad car, already thinking about how he'd spend his new cash. A steak dinner. a weekend trip, maybe some poker with the boys. Then, a crackle of static cut through the night. Bradley's radio. "All units, move in." The officer froze mid-step. His muscles tensed, a flicker of confusion flashing across his face. The wind shifted, and suddenly the night didn't feel so empty anymore. Shadows in the distance began to move. Footsteps, subtle but steady, echoed across the pavement. Bradley turned his head slowly, his hand instinctively hovering near his holster. His heartbeat quickened. What the hell? And then he saw them. Figures emerging from the darkness, stepping into the dim glow of the streetlights. Some in plain clothes, others in tactical vests, but all of them moving with purpose. FBI. Bradley's stomach twisted. Shaq hadn't just sent a text. He had set a trap. Bradley glanced at the Rolls-Royce again, his mind racing. His pulse pounded in his ears as he realized. This wasn't a routine stop. This wasn't an easy score. He had just walked into something much bigger than himself. The sound of sirens grew louder in the distance, getting closer by the second. Shaq, still leaning against his car, folded his arms and smiled. "Like I said," he murmured. "You sure you want to do that?" Bradley strolled toward his squad car, humming under his breath, oblivious to the storm about to hit him. The wallet in his pocket felt heavier than before, not because of the cash inside, but because he finally felt like he'd won again. Another easy payday. Until Shaq spoke. "You hear that?" Bradley stopped mid-step, his brow furrowing. He turned slightly, glancing at Shaq, who remained leaned against his Rolls-Royce, arms folded like a man who had all the time in the world. "Hear what?" Bradley asked, his hand instinctively shifting toward his belt where his holster rested. Shaq tilted his head slightly. "Listen real close." The parking lot had been quiet moments ago. Just the distant hum of passing traffic and the occasional gust of wind. But now, something had changed. Soft footsteps. Not one, not two, but multiple. Moving deliberately, closing in. Bradley's fingers twitched. His eyes darted around. A man in a dark hoodie stood near a parked sedan, his stance too rigid, too controlled. Another figure, a woman in a windbreaker, casually leaned against a lamppost, her hand inside her pocket as if gripping something. Then, from behind a black SUV, another man shifted, just enough for Bradley to catch the glint of something metallic. Badges. Bradley's pulse spiked. His eyes flicked back to Shaq, who hadn't moved an inch, his smirk widening just slightly. "You set me up," Bradley growled under his breath, his jaw tightening. Shaq shrugged. "Nah, man, you set yourself up." Bradley took a step back, his mind racing. His instincts screamed at him. "Get in the car. Get out." Now but then, clunk. The distinct sound of multiple car doors opening at once. From the darkness, figures began stepping out, slow, deliberate, surrounding him. Bradley's throat went dry. This wasn't just one or two agents. This was an operation, a takedown. For the first time that night, real fear gripped him. He had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, and the walls were closing in fast. Bradley's stomach tightened as he turned. Shadows stretched long under the flickering streetlights, figures moving with purpose. His years on the force had given him an instinct for danger, and every nerve in his body screamed that he was in trouble. One by one, they stepped into the light. Badges. Not the flimsy fakes street hustlers carried, but real government-issued FBI badges gleaming under the dim glow. Bradley's pulse pounded in his ears. He forced a smirk, but his hand instinctively drifted toward his holster. "Bad idea, pal," one of the agents warned, his voice calm but firm. A step closer, and Bradley could see the man's hand resting on his own weapon. Ready, waiting. Bradley hesitated. His fingers twitched. "You might want to think real hard before doing something stupid," another agent added, stepping to his right, cutting off his escape route. "Mind telling me what the hell is going on?" Bradley said, masking his growing panic with bravado. He straightened his shoulders, trying to project authority. "I don't answer to the feds. If you got a problem, take it up with my department." Shaq let out a low chuckle behind him. "Your department?" Shaq echoed, pushing off his car and casually strolling forward. "Yeah, about that." Bradley gritted his teeth. "What the hell are you smirking at, O'Neal?" Shaq didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a second phone, a different one from before. He held it up for Bradley to see and hit play. Bradley's face turned to stone. The video on the screen showed the past 10 minutes in crystal clear HD. His own hands reaching into Shaq's Rolls Royce, his fingers snatching the designer wallet off the passenger seat, his greedy smirk as he flipped it open and stuffed the cash into his pocket. Every angle, every movement, caught. His mouth went dry. "What the?" Bradley's words stuck in his throat. Shaq rotated the phone, revealing something even worse. The recording wasn't just saved, it was live, streaming to an audience. Viewers flooded the screen, thousands of comments scrolling at an insane speed. "Corrupt cop caught red-handed." Damn, Shaq really setting him up like a boss. "Yo, this dude is done." Bradley's face burned with humiliation. "Turn that off," he snapped, stepping forward. Shaq tilted his head, unfazed. "Why? The people seem to love it." Bradley clenched his fists. He could feel the weight of all the eyes on him, both in person and online. His whole career, his power, his influence, it was all crumbling right in front of him. The team leader of the FBI, a man with salt and pepper hair and a cold stare, stepped forward. His voice carried the final blow. "Officer Bradley," he announced, "you're under arrest for abuse of power, theft under the color of authority, and multiple counts of extortion." The words slammed into Bradley's chest like a freight train. "You can't do this," Bradley shouted, his voice rising with desperation. "I am the law." The team leader didn't blink. Not anymore. A pair of handcuffs glinted under the streetlights as an agent reached for them. Bradley's pulse skyrocketed. His fight-or-flight instinct kicked in, and then, without thinking, he ran. "Don't move!" someone barked. But Bradley wasn't listening. His boots slammed against the pavement as he bolted toward his squad car, his only hope of escape. A floodlight from a helicopter blazed to life, bathing the parking lot in harsh white light. Bradley skidded to a stop, his breath coming in short gasps. The sound of guns cocking filled the air. Surrounded. Shaq sighed, shaking his head. "Man, I was hoping you'd do something dumb." Bradley whirled around, his chest heaving. The team leader stepped forward, this time with zero patience in his voice. "On the ground," he ordered. "Now!" Bradley's knees buckled slightly, his hands twitched near his belt. He could make a run for it, go down fighting, but deep down, he knew. It was over. With one last defeated glance at the flashing cameras and recording phones, Bradley dropped to his knees. The cold bite of metal snapped around his wrists. The world had just watched a corrupt officer fall. And Shaq? He folded his arms, watching the downfall unfold, and smirked. "That," he said, "was perfect." Bradley's breath hitched. His pulse thundered in his ears as the cold steel of the cuffs clamped around his wrists. The weight of his situation came crashing down like a landslide. His eyes darted around. Shaq stood motionless, arms crossed, that damn smirk still on his face. The FBI agents surrounding him weren't just regular cops. They were professionals, trained to expect resistance. But Bradley wasn't thinking logically anymore. Panic took over. His body moved before his mind could stop him. In a burst of pure adrenaline, Bradley ripped himself backward, yanking his left wrist free from the agent's grip before they fully secured the cuffs. His heart pounded like a jackhammer. And then, he ran. "Hey, stop!" Someone barked behind him, but Bradley wasn't listening. He tore across the parking lot, his boots slamming against the pavement, lungs burning. He wasn't going to let some celebrity and a bunch of feds take him down. He had connections. He had options. He just needed to get to his squad car. Shaq, still unmoving, let out a low chuckle. "Bad choice, man." Bradley ignored him, sprinting full speed toward his cruiser, fumbling for the keys in his belt. If he could just get inside. A black SUV screeched into his path. Bradley skidded to a stop, his boots nearly slipping on the pavement. An FBI agent stepped out, gun drawn but aimed low. "Don't be stupid, Bradley." Bradley's breath came in short, ragged gasps. Trapped. He looked over his shoulder. Agents were closing in from behind. But he wasn't done yet. In a split-second decision, he pivoted hard left and bolted toward the alleyway beside the diner. If he could slip through, disappear into the city, he could... Whoosh! A deafening roar split through the night. The entire alleyway lit up like it was broad daylight. Bradley barely had time to react before a blinding white spotlight from above pinned him in place. He froze, his arms instinctively rising to shield his face. The light was so powerful, it felt like the sun itself had descended onto the parking lot. The chopping blades of a helicopter filled the air, drowning out the FBI agent's shouts. A deep, commanding voice boomed from a loudspeaker. "Officer Bradley, surrender immediately. You are surrounded." Bradley's stomach dropped. A freaking FBI chopper? His legs trembled. The escape plan that had seemed so clear seconds ago was now impossible. He turned again, desperate for another exit. But there was none. More agents poured into the parking lot, weapons drawn but still lowered. They weren't here to kill him. They were here to watch him break. His breath came in sharp gasps. The realization hit like a freight train. This was over. The moment stretched, suffocating him. Every move he had left was a losing one. Shaq's voice cut through the chaos, steady and calm. "You got two choices, Bradley." Bradley turned, chest heaving, sweat trickling down his forehead. Shaq hadn't moved an inch. His face wasn't mocking anymore. There was no laughter, just certainty. "You can stand down, or—" Shaq nodded toward the 20-plus armed agents, the bright beam from the chopper still burning into Bradley's skin. "You can make the worst mistake of your life." Bradley's legs wobbled. His hand twitched toward his holster. Pure instinct. A warning shot cracked through the night. Bradley flinched, his breath hitching as a bullet buried itself in the ground inches from his foot. "Hands in the air!" an agent roared. Bradley's body reacted before his pride could stop it. His hands shot up, trembling. His knees buckled, and for the first time in his life, Bradley dropped to the ground in surrender. The moment hung heavy in the air. The mighty Officer Bradley, the cop who had spent years intimidating others, was now on his knees, completely powerless. The FBI team leader approached, his voice cold. "Bradley, you're under arrest." Handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists. This time, no escape. Shaq took a step forward, looking down at the disgraced officer. "Told you," he said simply. Bradley didn't respond. He couldn't, because for the first time in his life, he wasn't in control anymore. Bright camera lights pierced the night, cutting through the chaos as a local news van screeched to a stop at the edge of the scene. The side door flung open, and a reporter practically jumped out, microphone in hand, while a cameraman scrambled to capture the unfolding drama. Social media had already exploded. The moment the FBI chopper had shined its spotlight down, bystanders had whipped out their phones, live streaming Bradley's downfall. And now the whole world was watching. "This is illegal!" Bradley's voice was raw, hoarse from the panic gripping his throat. He struggled against the cuffs, his once arrogant demeanor completely shattered. "I'm a cop. You can't do this." An FBI agent, standing tall beside him, let out a short, amused scoff. "Not anymore." Bradley's face twisted with rage. "You set me up. This is entrapment." Shaq, who had been watching quietly up until now, finally took a step forward. His massive frame cast a long shadow over Bradley, making the disgraced officer seem even smaller than he already was. With an eerie calmness, Shaq asked, "Where's my wallet?" The entire crowd fell silent. Even the news reporter, mid-sentence, turned to listen. Bradley froze. The cameras were locked on him. The entire internet was watching. He still had it. The weight of Shaq's wallet pressed against his pocket. The stolen cash inside now felt like a ticking time bomb. His mind raced, desperately searching for a way out, a way to twist this, to flip the script. But there was no script anymore. He had lost control of the story. Bradley's jaw clenched. His eyes darted around, scanning for options. None came. Then in one last pathetic act of defiance, he yanked the wallet from his pocket and threw it. The thick leather spun through the air, tumbling in slow motion. But Shaq was ready. With lightning reflexes, he snatched it midair, catching it with ease. He flipped it open, revealing the untouched stack of crisp $100 bills inside. And just like that, Bradley's last excuse vanished. The news anchor grinned, her voice sharp as she turned toward the camera. "Well, folks, there you have it. Officer Bradley caught red-handed on live TV. Corruption doesn't pay, But tonight, it sure got exposed. Bradley's face burned as the weight of public humiliation crashed down on him. This wasn't just an arrest. It was a reckoning, and it was too late to undo it. Bradley's wallet toss was meant to be a distraction, a last-ditch effort to shift the attention, to regain some control. But Shaq was faster. With a swift motion, his massive hands snatched it midair, his grip firm, controlled, almost effortless. He turned it over in his palm, flipping it open with the casual confidence of a man who already knew the outcome. The crisp $100 bills were still inside, completely untouched. Shaq smirked, shaking his head. "Thanks," he said, voice deep and deliberate. Then after a beat, he added, "You're gonna need a lawyer." The crowd erupted. Laughter, gasps, a few scattered, "Oh-ho!" Reactions echoed through the parking lot. The news camera stayed locked on Bradley, whose face had turned an unhealthy shade of red. But the real chaos was happening online. The FBI's live stream was spreading like wildfire. The moment Bradley had been caught on camera, stealing from Shaq, it had been broadcast in real time. The agency had planned it that way. Public exposure left no room for cover-ups, no room for internal investigations that led nowhere. The internet exploded in reaction. Shaq just helped bust a dirty cop live. No way this dude gets away with it. Can't believe this guy was out here robbing people under the badge. Disgusting. Shaq did more police work in one night than this dude has his whole career. Within minutes, Bradley's name was trending. Old stories started resurfacing. Complaints, accusations, reports. People who had tried to speak out about him before, but had been ignored, dismissed, or silenced. Now, they had. Proof. The FBI agent in charge, a man in his late 50s with a no-nonsense stare, stepped forward. He looked at Bradley, then at Shaq. "You did good tonight," he said, nodding. Shaq shrugged. "Just helped speed things up." The FBI agent turned back to his team. "Get him out of here." The agents moved in, dragging Bradley toward the waiting squad car. His protests were weaker now, his voice hoarse, all the bravado stripped away. He wasn't a cop anymore. He was just another criminal in cuffs. The moment was sealed forever in history. A corrupt officer caught in broad daylight. And Shaq? He had just made sure the world would never forget it. Bradley sat in the cold, gray interrogation room, his hands clasped tightly together on the metal table in front of him. His knee bounced uncontrollably, his body betraying the fear he was trying so hard to suppress. The fluorescent light overhead flickered slightly, casting sharp shadows along the walls. For the first time in his career, he was the one being questioned. No badge, no gun, no power. Just a suspect. The door swung open violently, slamming against the wall. The police chief stepped inside, his face flushed with anger, his uniform slightly unbuttoned at the collar like he had just yanked his tie off in frustration. He looked at Bradley like he was something rotten that had been sitting in his fridge for too long. "You embarrass this department," the chief spat, his voice sharp, cutting through the heavy silence in the room. Bradley opened his mouth to speak, to defend himself, to say something, but nothing came out. The chief took a step forward, planting both hands on the table and leaning in. His eyes burned with disgust. "Stealing from civilians? Extorting people? And you had the nerve to get caught on camera doing it?" He scoffed, shaking his head. "You know how many calls we got today? Reporters, city officials, the damn mayor? You just turned our whole department into a joke." Bradley clenched his jaw. "Chief, Save it." The voice didn't belong to the chief. Bradley turned his head slightly as the FBI agent from earlier stepped inside, a thick folder tucked under his arm. The badge on his belt gleamed under the harsh lighting, a reminder that this wasn't just a slap on the wrist. This was serious. The agent pulled out a chair across from Bradley and sat down, sliding the folder onto the table. He opened it slowly, revealing a thick stack of papers. "Evidence. We've been building this case for months," the agent said, flipping through the pages. "We've got multiple reports, body cam footage that mysteriously disappeared, financial records that don't add up. And now we've got a live broadcast of you stealing $5,000 from one of the most recognizable people on the planet." He snapped the folder shut. "You're looking at 10 years minimum." Bradley's heart plummeted. 10 years. 10 years in a cell. His mind raced, searching for an escape, an out. He leaned forward, licking his dry lips, forcing a weak smirk onto his face. Look, I get it. You need a win. But let's be real. I wasn't the only one doing this. You want names? He spread his hands. I can cut a deal, right? The FBI agent exchanged a glance with the chief, his expression unreadable. The tension in the room thickened. Bradley had no idea if he had just saved himself or made things even worse. The television screen flickered, casting a dull glow over the dimly lit room. News anchors spoke in urgent voices, their words carrying the weight of something much bigger than a single man's downfall. Former Officer Bradley is now in federal custody after a shocking sting operation revealed years of corruption. The footage, which has gone viral, shows him stealing money from Shaquille O'Neal, leading to his immediate arrest. Shaq sat back on his couch, shaking his head. He exhaled slowly, rubbing his chin. Power doesn't make you untouchable. The reality was settling in across the city. Bradley wasn't an isolated case. He was a symptom of a deeper problem, a culture of unchecked power hidden behind a badge. His phone buzzed. A text. Unknown number. We appreciate what you did. Some of us want real change too. Shaq stared at the message, then at the name attached to it. Officer D. Carter, a cop. Shaq's brows lifted slightly. He responded simply, "Let's talk." The next afternoon, Shaq arrived at a small coffee shop tucked away from the media frenzy. It was quiet, the kind of place where real conversations happened. A young officer sat at a corner table, his uniform crisp but his face weary. He stood as Shaq approached. "Mr. O'Neal," the officer said, extending a hand. Shaq shook it, then gestured for them to sit. The officer hesitated, then leaned forward. "I just wanted to say thank you for exposing him. A lot of us knew Bradley was dirty, but no one ever spoke up." Shaq studied him. "Why not?" The officer sighed, glancing out the window. "Fear. If you push back against the wrong people, suddenly your backup is slow when you need it, or your reports go missing. It's a system, and it protects the worst of us." Shaq nodded slowly. "And you're saying there's more?" The officer met his eyes. "There's always more." Silence hung between them. Shaq tapped his fingers on the table. "So what do you want from me?" The officer swallowed hard. "Help us. The good ones. Help us make noise loud enough that they can't ignore it." Shaq leaned back, considering it. He wasn't a cop. He wasn't a politician. But he had a voice. And right now, the city was listening. That evening, Shaq stood before a crowd at a press conference. Cameras flashed, microphones pointed his way. He adjusted the mic, then spoke simply. Bradley thought his badge made him untouchable. Turns out it made him more accountable. Murmurs spread through the crowd. This ain't just about one cop. It's about all of them. The ones who abuse their power and think the world won't notice. "Well, we noticed." A reporter called out. "What happens next?" Shaq smirked, stepping away from the mic. "One down, more to go." Shaq helps FBI take down corrupt cop, and it's trending worldwide. The news anchor chuckled, shaking his head as the screen behind him displayed the now viral footage of Bradley's arrest. The clip had been played millions of times, analyzed from every angle, and turned into memes, think pieces, and debates on police reform. "Folks, this is one for the history books," the anchor continued, flipping to another screen. "Shaq's corruption is the #1 trending topic worldwide." Social media was on fire. "A justice for all. We need more people like Shaq, using his platform to actually make a difference." Kid Blue Wall exposed. How many other Bradleys are out there? It's time to clean house. King of memes. Bradley went from "I run this town" to "Sir, you have the right to remain silent" in 24 hours. Shaq scrolled through his phone, seeing the impact unfold in real time. But what really caught his attention wasn't just the jokes or the celebration. It was the stories. Hundreds of people had started sharing their own encounters with corrupt officers, some who had shaken them down, others who had let their power go unchecked for years. One post stood out. Maya J87. "Officer Bradley stole $800 from my brother last year during a traffic stop. We reported it. Nothing happened. Thank you, Shaq, for making sure he didn't get away with it this time." Shaq's jaw tightened. This was bigger than one dirty cop. The next morning, his phone buzzed with another alert. Breaking, FBI announces deeper investigation into police corruption after viral sting operation. Shaq exhaled. Good. But his work wasn't done. Later that evening, he sat in his private office staring at the city skyline. The world had reacted, but now came the real challenge, turning this moment into something lasting. His assistant knocked on the door. Shaq, you have a visitor. Shaq turned. Who? The door opened and a young officer stepped in, looking nervous but determined. Mr. O'Neal, he said, standing tall. I'm Officer Daniels. I saw what you did. A lot of us did. Some of us want to clean this mess up from the inside. Shaq leaned forward, intrigued. Go on. Daniels took a deep breath. I was wondering, you want to help us with another case? Shaq smirked. Now you're talking. The wind brushed against Shaq's face as he stood on the rooftop, looking out at the city bathed in the golden hues of sunset. Below him, cars moved like tiny specks of light, the heartbeat of a city that had just witnessed something historic. He exhaled. There's still work to do. His words weren't for anyone but himself, a quiet reminder that justice wasn't a one-time event. The past few days had been a whirlwind, Bradley's takedown, the viral explosion, and now the ripple effect spreading across the country. The number Shaq's corruption movement wasn't slowing down. People were speaking up. Investigations had been launched. Departments were under scrutiny. One cop had fallen. But how many more were still out there? Shaq's phone buzzed. A text from the FBI. 2 more officers from Bradley's precinct placed on leave pending investigation. Shaq smirked. Good. He scrolled further. More stories. More people coming forward. A single moment had sparked something bigger than he'd ever imagined. Then a different notification popped up. Donation confirmed, $250,000 to Future Law Enforcement Leaders Program. Shaq had just made sure young, ethical cops had the resources they needed to step up. Because the real fight wasn't just about removing the corrupt. It was about replacing them with the right people. His thoughts were interrupted by a voice behind him. Didn't take you for the rooftop type. Shaq turned. Officer Daniels, the young cop who had come to him the night before, stood at the door, hands in his pockets. Needed some air, Shaq said. City looks different from up here. Daniels stepped forward, following Shaq's gaze. It feels different too. What you did, it changed things. People are actually hopeful. Shaq nodded. Hope is good, but action is better. Daniels hesitated, then took out his phone, showing Shaq a new headline. More officers under review after public outcry over corruption. Shaq glanced at it, then at Daniels. You think this is enough? Daniels shook his head. Not even close. That was the answer Shaq wanted to hear. Daniels cleared his throat. A few of us, young officers, were tired of this mess. We want to be part of the solution, but we need backup. We need people like you. Shaq turned fully to him, arms crossed. What are you asking me? Daniels didn't flinch. Help us. Keep the pressure on. Make sure the world doesn't forget what we started here. Shaq studied him for a moment, then cracked a small smile. I was already planning on it. Daniels grinned. Shaq turned back to the city, his expression thoughtful. This was just the beginning. Justice wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about making an example out of one bad cop. It was about making sure it never happened again. He took one last deep breath, then pulled out his phone and typed 3 simple words. Who's next? And with that, he walked away, ready for the next battle.